Welcome to the call, especially for joining on this lovely sunny evening, or at least that's the case in the Swindon area. I'm very happy to introduce this panel session this evening, organised by the Swindon IET network, which I chair. So we have an excellent group of panelists this evening who are all experts in their respective fields. And I want to take this opportunity to thank them for joining this evening and giving up their valuable time. I think this event is going to be particularly topical. It's something that's been in the press a lot of late, so I'm very interested to hear the discussion this evening. Our event manager, Hamid Falaki, will give the full introduction to the panel in a minute or so. But before then, I'd just like to highlight some housekeeping. So the event's scheduled for about an hour. We've got a bit of extra time in case there's spillover, depending on how many questions are raised. Also like to highlight that although this webinar is broadcast, there will be Q&A at the end, and to ask questions, I'd ask that you raise them in the Q&A button, which you should see, at least it's on the bottom of my screen. So please encourage you to ask your questions there, and then they'll be addressed as we move to the end of the presentations and the discussion. We'll do our best to address all of those, but have to appreciate that we do have a finite amount of time, so I can't promise to get to all of them. But those that we can't, we will endeavour to try and address those offline. The webinar is being recorded, so there is the opportunity to listen again. We have a dedicated YouTube channel where you can view it, and the link will be shared. After the event, you should receive an email requesting feedback on this evening's event, and very much encourage you to provide feedback, because that's the way in which we can tailor our future events. And on that note, there's also a link to a survey which will be shared in the chat, which again very much encourage you to respond to. This is an IET wide survey trying to gather feedback on the whole series of IET events that have been broadcast of late. So not just the Swindon network, but the IET as a whole. So with that, I'd like to thank the panelists once again, and also thank you all for attending. And I'll hand over to our event manager, Hamid, who will give the full introduction for tonight's panel session. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter, and welcome everyone to our debate on UK's 5G supply chain diversification strategy. Just to share with you today, we're going to have a debate around scientific and business impact on UK 5G's diversification strategy. This panel will address various questions and various topics around why should we have such a change, and what is the likely change to be, and what are the technologies that we need to embrace for this change, and business opportunities ahead as a result of this strategy. Among our panelists, I'm proud to introduce our panel this evening. Professor Dimitros Simeonidi, Director of Smart Internet Lab, University of Bristol. Dr. Dritan Kalashi, Director of Technology 5G at Digital Catapult. Dr. Abhaya Sumanasina, Spectrum and Regulation Practice Lead at Real Wireless. And Mr. Paul Robinson, our Industry Telecom Wireless Specialist. There's a little bit of background I'd like to share with you about 5G UK, UK's 5G supply chain diversifications. The Department of DCMS, one of the UK governmental departments, late last year announced that this, I'm going to send a link on the website so that we all know what has resulted in this discussion. So in the chat, I'm going to put this link that will tell you about 5G supply chain diversification strategy announced in December. I think it was updated by the Minister of DCMS, giving you the background and summary. And we could have gone and spent time and give you the background on the architecture, overview of 5G network architecture, but just to save space and time, again, I'm putting the link from the DCMS, giving you the background about the 5G network overview, architecture overview, and where the impacts are. In our panel, we're going to touch on around the actual technology, about interoperability, about regulations, and about the usability of this impact. So I'm going to start by first asking Dimitra about to reflect on the 5G UK supply chain diversification strategy, as she is part of the task force appointed, one of the members of the task force that appointed by DCMS. Welcome, Dimitra. Could you please tell us your view and reflect on this 5G UK supply chain diversification strategy? Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Hamid, and hello, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. So I have been asked to reflect on the work that has been done in the Telecoms Diversification Task Force as a member of this task force. This is a group of experts that actually has been set up by DCMS about 6 months ago under the leadership of Lord Livingstone. And the purpose of the task force has been to identify solutions and opportunities to diversify the telecom supply market in the UK. Now, the task force acted in response of 2 government documents, as you mentioned as well, Hamid. The one is the 5G supply chain diversification strategy, and the second one is the telecom security bill. These documents set actually the strong intention of the UK government to ensure the security of our telecoms networks and to build a competitive and innovative supply chain. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to discuss the recommendations of this task force, as the publication of these recommendations has been delayed. I was planning to do so, but this is last minute change of plans. However, it doesn't do any harm to describe to you the 4 areas where actually the task force has considered. The first one is telecom standards. And the consideration is how we can make the UK strong in standards so we can influence and eventually lead in international standards. The second area that we considered was government regulatory policy to support diversification in the telco sector. So what kind of government regulatory interventions we should do here in the UK? The third one was interventions for accelerating the adoption of Open RAN in particular, and I know that others are going to talk a lot about this after me. And the fourth one, which is very close to my heart, is support for long-term research and innovation in order to build UK capability for future generations of telecom technology. Now, if we are looking at the issues that they have created lack of diversity and complete reliance from a very small number of vendors in the UK in terms of supply chains, that actually is a problem in the making for many decades. I mean, since probably the demise of Marconi in the UK, with actually not much intervention from the government. So from my perspective, I'm clear that the main driver at this point for diversification is not commercial and technological, it's national security driver and not any drivers associated at this point on performance or cost. Now, although I cannot, as I said, actually discuss recommendations, I would like to communicate some thoughts around diversification. And the first one is that no doubt diversification will require specific and targeted interventions in order to stimulate the supply market. There is an issue that we have, and we have to make some interventions for that. However, these interventions should stop short of imposing solutions on UK operators at the cost of higher prices, slower rollout, or less capability for the consumer ourselves. The second one, it is important to recognize that while we have to take some actions immediately in order to have meaningful impact in the short term, other measures are even more important. Specifically, when we are planning for our longer-term sustainability in the sector in the UK, the creation of an ambitious R&D program, which will require long-term and consistent commitment from the government across the broader telecom and relevant technology priorities, is absolutely necessary. And third, we should realize that actually the UK represents a very small part of the global demand for telecom infrastructure. It is therefore very important that we coordinate our efforts through international partnership in order to remain relevant in the future. We need to think at international and not national scale. And just in my opinion, there is not a UK only solution to diversification. If we believe this, probably we are deluded. Now, I am an academic, and I think long-term. So if the UK telecoms are to become long-term sustainable, in my opinion, we have to address two things. The first is we need to realize that availability of skills and expertise will be a critical factor. Telecoms is not anymore a single technical discipline, and expertise that they are required now in our sector are across a number of disciplines, including, of course, traditional telecommunication technologies, both hardware and software, but also IT, security, and AI, to say the least. Currently in the UK, there are skill gaps across all these areas and really severe lack of combined expertise across them. So building a stronger, sustainable foundation of suitable telecom skills should be central in supporting the UK's long-term role in telecom ecosystem. And the second one I mentioned before, we really need to establish an ambitious program for the research and development of future networks, and that includes 6G, and generate at last significant UK IP for our sector. This should be developed in partnership, of course, with industry, both operators and vendors, academia, SMEs, and startups. We should aim to create new opportunities for open innovation and collaborative R&D that will become the foundation for the UK supply chain in the next 10 to 20 years. Not the immediate interventions, but the longer term. In my opinion, the last thing we want is to find ourselves in the same situation in 10 years from now.
Thank you, Dimitra. That was very interesting topics. I'm sure there are questions that are coming up. Just seen one question coming up, but we'll come back to that question in a few minutes. I'm going to move on to our next panel discussion, and once we've gone through all the panelists, we'll come back to reflect on what Dimitra has just told us and bring one or two questions to Dimitra. Dritten, I'd like you to take the next step, please, and tell us about the need for interoperability and the program Sonic at Digital Catapult and Ofcom, the joint program, how that is going, and also add to it. Please tell us about business solutions to the field of and the new markets. So the drivers behind this and how we can see the new entrants, new businesses coming to UK or from global to UK or UK to global. Please, Dritten, tell us what you think and how you reflect on this.
Yep. Thank you, Hamid, and thank you, Alter. It's a pleasure to be in Swindon. I used to drive past Swindon quite a lot of times, going back and forth from Bristol. And good evening, everyone. So just to keep to time, as Dimitra said, if we look in the space of the telecoms, there are three things that kind of are changing in the mobile telecommunications environment, some of which are kind of man-made and some of which are market forces. So on one side, we have a very, very high level of commoditization of connectivity services with squeezing operator investment and potentially, and through them also their suppliers. This is also associated with a very high level of R&D costs and a kind of a market forces that has created a consolidation of the into a small group of very, very large vendors across the world, but in particular in a market basis, an idea that a winner takes it all, where we until now we have had only three vendor suppliers in all of the UK national network. On the other side, we have a man-made situation, which it's a political or geopolitical situation, which is the national strategic priorities. The supplier market is too narrow, and certainly because of other changes that are happening, and high-risk vendors emerging that will not align with that increases the need for the diversification of the supply chain. The third element that I will mention here is the fact that the technology trends. So we are looking at, since the start of a very, very, very aggressive, I would say, both in academic but in industry terms of softwareization in networks, in particular with software-defined networks a long time ago. Disaggregation and softwareization of the networking systems is an unstoppable trend. That in and of itself, and it is exhibiting itself in the mobile networks. It is exhibiting itself in the Open RAN approaches. It's effectively creating technology solutions that can potentially address the need for supply chain diversification. Now, if we take a step back and we look at the fact that the network system itself is disaggregating and fragmenting between multiple players. It's shifting from monolithic equipment and single RAN, where very, very often we have seen, as we have seen in the UK and all over the world, we have deployment networks in mobile networks, which effectively are set up in very close relationship between mobile network operators and vendors. Once the contracts are signed, they will follow standardization, but those networks and the networking technologies are opaque, and in many cases the mobile network operators are locked in the vendors that they are contracting in. On the other side, we have this offer where, in particular in networks, through software-defined networks, network function virtualization and softwareization and virtualization, we can see a disaggregation and an emergence of potential suppliers where the monolithic radio access network that we have seen until now is starting to be kind of broken down. Now, if we look at the way that the technology in the mobile industry is developing, and in particular the way that we see the generational sets of the technologies and standards, telecommunications as an industry is heavily based on standardization. That standardization does not necessarily lead to high level of interoperability, because a lot of the interoperability is effectively resolved within single vendor systems. There are very, very few interfaces which are truly interoperable through implementation, independently of the way that they are already set up in excellent technical standards in ETSI. So the standardization works. It works over a long period of time, but standardization until now has been used as a mechanism to effectively lead in some way over the past 20 years on this consolidation of the market across a group of very, very large vendors, which, to be frank, have done a wonderful job on delivering very, very high quality, high performance systems at a kind of reasonable cost. What follows from the standardization is usually integration tests, and integration tests will happen between mobile network operators and vendors. Now, if we take a step back and we look at a world when the mobile radio network, the control unit, the BBUs, the baseband units, or calling them distribution units now, and the centralized unit in Open RAN parlance, they will be delivered or supplied by different vendors. And if the number of those vendors increases, that is where the need for interoperability assurance arises. And that is where we shift from a standardization-centric world view to a more of a softwareization and software-based and implementation view, when the implementability and the working of the different systems becomes the priority. So in this particular context, and because of the need for interventions in this space, Digital Catapult and Ofcom, with funding from the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, as part of the Diversification Task Force, made a suggestion and a proposal to create a commercially neutral and open environment, which we are calling the Smart RAN Open Networking Interoperability Center, or short SONIC, dedicated to effectively support companies, small and large, international and national, so not just UK, but also international, to effectively create an environment for collaborative and collective testing, as I said, in a commercially neutral environment of the solutions, both from a standards perspective, but equally and most importantly from an implementation and integration testing perspective, during the in the phase of the development space, what we in innovation world typically is called a technology readiness level 5 to 7, just before you effectively are ready to go and start putting system integrations together and going out. So in this space, SONIC is a joint program between Digital Catapult and the regulator for testing interoperability and integration of open and software-centric networking solutions. And we are deliberately starting with Open RAN, but we will expand more towards open networks. We are looking in SONIC to foster an open disaggregated network ecosystem in the UK, both for large and small suppliers, both from the UK and international, but with an intention to engage in the supply chain in the UK to help to develop this particular supply chain with multiple suppliers over the next 5 years. SONIC will be live and operational. We have started in November, and we will launch at the beginning of June, the first week of June, end of May, first week of June. And at the moment, we have 9 different vendors providing all components on radio units, distribution units, centralized units, and radio intelligent controllers, backed up into the 5G testbed that Digital Catapult is using. Looking forward, what we want to use SONIC for is to literally use the interoperability and integration testing as a lever for the whole ecosystem in the UK to effectively look at the reality of the Open RAN and probably provide a mechanism in the UK and for the UK to provide input into the standardization processes, but driven primarily from an integration and interoperability and implementability perspective. SONIC is seen as one of the instruments that will exist in this space. We are aligning and working closely with TIP. Of course, we are talking to ORAN Alliance. We are very conscious that there will be a lot of work done by mobile operators already in their labs in adopting and testing the different technologies. But in SONIC, it's particularly to help and prepare a pipeline of companies during the development stages with a high level of confidence that they can enter into the supply chain of telecommunications in the UK, hitting that desired phase that we are calling a technology readiness level 8 or 9. And that is effectively where the primary needs we see that it is from a SONIC perspective. There are other aspects that need to be tested on the security and also a pipeline towards our commercialization once people are ready to go into the commercial deployment. But that is something which SONIC will work with other organizations like the UK Telecommunications Lab or with the R&D capability that Dimitra mentioned as one of the several interventions alongside also with the industry initiatives. And this is the space where we will see a major change. And if we get this right, all of us together, SONIC being one of several instruments in the UK, then genuinely we can see tremendous transformation into the supply chain and the telecoms and the way that we build advanced digital infrastructure for the future.
Thank you very much, Drithan. I think it's very good to hear that the SONIC program is well equipped with a number of vendors, and I think it's sort of a compliment to what Dimitra was telling earlier about that there are the 4 areas to touch on and the drivers, maybe national security, but there are other reasons to consider. I'm come back to you with a couple of questions afterwards, Drithan. Thank you very much. And I think questions are coming up from the floor, but we'll come to the questions from the floor later, where our panel will address them. But I want to go to Abaya, please. Abaya, with his regulator background, is actually a good point in the discussion to touch on. We heard about the standards are important, and there are other aspects of regulation that we need to think about. So, Abaya, could you please tell us about the barriers from regulation point of view in regard to this 5G supply chain diversification plan? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Hamid and Walter. Thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be here, and good evening to you all. So before I talk about going into details, I think let me very briefly explain what is spectrum and regulation in 1 minute or so.
Of course, please.
Who are new to the topic. So spectrum, any wireless user needs spectrum. and obviously any wireless users consider that as an invaluable asset, scarce resource, because the part of the spectrum that is useful for wireless transmission is limited. Spectrum is very wide, but it is the part of the electromagnetic spectrum that is desirable for radio spectrum is what we are talking here. Can be repurposed, and therefore the properties of these spectrum bands has unique characteristics, and it's very difficult to replace. In other words, substitute. So each spectrum band has their own characteristics and serves a purpose in a network, in mobile networks. So Ofcom manages spectrum for civilian use, and why do we need to regulate the spectrum? Because that limited spectrum has to be used most efficiently. Many different services has to coexist. Now I've mentioned a few things that I can relate to this particular work. So when we talk about spectrum, it is very important that spectrum is harmonized. Why? Because if the spectrum is harmonized, means many other countries will use the same spectrum for same service. Therefore, the equipment manufacturers now can address a large market share. Therefore, the economies of scale will bring the cost down. So all these things are really important in terms of diversification as well, because if a particular country uses a specific spectrum that is not harmonized, you need customized equipment. It's that loses the whole argument about diversification, because not much choice for the service provider in terms of vendors producing equipment. So in this diversification strategy, there are a few things identified: spectrum-related barriers and ensuring efficient use of spectrum. So efficient use of spectrum can be very broad. So one of the Ofcom's duties is also the efficient use of spectrum. And so when it comes to regulation, it's really important in terms of driving the innovation. Again, one of the Ofcoms, something that Ofcoms are pushing for as a regulator. So how can innovation happen here? I'll give you one example specifically. So at the moment, 26 gigahertz band, which is, we call it millimeter wave spectrum. Ofcom allows indoor use this particular spectrum under a specific licensing scheme. So I think the objective is to look at outdoor use of this spectrum, and how can the innovation and the regulation works there in this particular spectrum. So there's a study we have carried out as well for the UK Spectrum Policy Forum, looking at this spectrum band, the moving away from the traditional approach where spectrum license nationally. This is about now segmenting where mobile users really need the spectrum and have that licensing approach. That is only where they might use this spectrum most densely populated areas. But rest of the area, I think about 99% of the country, we can easily segment as a less dense populated area related to this specific band. Now that's a band, you can have that areas can have a novel approach. You can have the spectrum sharing mechanisms so that newcomers can now deploy these different new services. So what the benefit of that is that this harmonized spectrum, because it's harmonized, global ecosystem is going to be available most likely in the coming years. Now, anybody outside operators, anybody can have access to this spectrum, this globally harmonized spectrum band for very, they don't have to go through an auction, in other words. Now that can introduce innovation really, and that those kind of, I think, let's say, schemes can promote competition, that can drive new equipment availability, wider availability of different types of equipment from different vendors. And that is one example I can think of in terms of driving the innovation and the regulation fit for this purpose, and driving this diversification. So there are other things in terms of the regulator can do. What can Ofcom do? So something that Ofcom regularly do is participate in this international fora and try to harmonize the spectrum at ITU and at European level, so that the spectrum is harmonized, and Ofcom and the countries can individually align to this harmonized spectrum to get the benefits of economies of scale. So these are the things that Ofcom and can do. So moving away from the traditional licensing and to allow new ways of using spectrum. So future, it may not just necessarily have to be limited to more spectrum and more spectrum. It can also be the new ways of spectrum sharing, becoming a very topic, the hot topic. Lots of regulators are looking at this. So maybe I'll pause for the moment, but there are many things that regulator, Ofcom can do as a regulator to drive these things, and in terms of diversification, so promoting innovation to make it, make the spectrum most efficiently used and help for diversification. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abhay. I think you touched on quite a nice topic of share the spectrum. You led to that topic, and I will come back to questions on that. It's quite a new move from Ofcom. I think I don't know if Ofcom was the first regulator in the world coming up with that approach, but it certainly is the most welcoming approach, I would say. We'll come back to that. Thank you. I'd like to go to Paul. Paul, thank you for joining our panel. And as our wireless specialist tonight, could you please? There are questions that Paul will come back from the question from the delegates, the registrants. But we'll come to those questions later. But the very first thing I'd like to ask you is from the user of the industry in telecom and telecommunication equipment for an infrastructure to provide services either in enterprise or private network or in. Tell us what you think is this supply chain will impact as a typical user of this industry. Tell us your feeling of where do you see the changes that you have to deal with as a user of this technology?
Yes. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much. It's actually so refreshing to see some names from the past on the participants list, who I did used to work with at various R&D facilities some 20 and maybe 5 years ago at Alcatel-Lucent, of course. It is actually quite interesting to listen to the other delegates' insight into the industry, and it sort of made me reminiscent of what happened in the 1970s and 1980s when we had a new government come in, and it was imperative that Honda, for example, was brought in as a transplant organisation, and that gave us a lot of support here in Swindon. And it made me think that perhaps now it's time to induce a technology company in here to bring its R&D facilities here to some point. That's just an observation I hesitate to ask, because from an infrastructure point of view, from a mobile operator, having an infrastructure supplier locally is invaluable. You can pick up the phone and have a contact. So I've been taking a few notes here and just fresh in my mind, having been involved with Ofcom recently and almost on a day-to-day basis, one of my observations is that 26 gig and the frequency and spectrum sharing is absolutely critical. But of course, from an infrastructure point of view, it brings a lot of concerns. One is the Ofcom policy of a good neighbour policy, which means from a spectrum sharing point of view, coexistence, you could have ad hoc interference coming in and coming out. And clearly our new infrastructure, the operations and maintenance of that, the KPIs coming from it, we would need to understand what is happening in that band and whether we can predict it, whether we can move the feature somewhere else, is perhaps something that we've never faced with before. Clearly we've had interference come in which case we would avoid those channels, particularly operating GSM systems in Hong Kong, where mobile FM phones were still in use there in the 1990s and early 2020s. Particular channels you couldn't use from a frequency hopping point of view in 2G systems, for example. It just used to be avoided. But now, if you've got a whole band there, several tens of megahertz, it could happen anywhere. So some agility will be needed. And the proposal is we have DSA, dynamic spectrum access. So I think that is fairly clear what it means. How that is managed, I think, remains to be seen. So we have a challenge now for Sonic, I think, which is with these multiple vendors. Some of them will be niche, some of them will be, say, indoor TDD systems, exterior FDD systems, is how we manage it. The costs involved, the training involved. And one of the aspects of having a single vendor, admittedly, you could have private messaging between the radio resource unit and the baseband units and then into the core network, is the single source for training. These are other costs downstream that aren't necessarily recognized. And that is something to consider from an infrastructure point of view. So we have a whole range of new facilities here, of new features coming in with 5G. And we've got utilities, the IoT, low latency, asset management, that type of thing. Needing perhaps from, and this is where we can perhaps be imaginative, use network slicing to support these different aspects of what 5G should support. We've got possibly a lot of automotive coming in, real-time mission critical systems. So emergency systems, mission control, manufacturing, and then overriding all of this, we have security implications, denial of service. What happens when we, as an infrastructure supporter and operations and maintenance, what happens if we get, do we have a whole new redundancy network sitting there, or can we reconfigure it on the fly? A lot of questions there, really. Moving on to 26 gig, I think this is perhaps a little bit fanciful, that the power requirements for this multitude of devices will be very low. And we've probably heard of broadcast power before, but I think there could be a niche market for for small devices to have broadcast power in use. So almost like RFID devices. Again, how do you manage that? So from my point of view, the infrastructure, the biggest challenge is OA&M and training. Right, I do have another concern, which is in the DCMS white paper, there is no mention of, as far as I can see, and I could be wrong here, is carbon neutral by 2050. And whilst we need to be aware of that, it would be interesting to see how this is being tackled within 5G. We have low energy devices, obviously in the millimetric waves above 6 gig, then that could be very low power, but below that, high power amplifiers, that type of thing, I'm not sure where we're going with that. For example, there's a very, very big deployment now in PRC, well over 500,000 base stations, maybe more, in around Shanghai and other places like that, those big high-rise areas. How is the power for that being supported? Is low energy switching being implemented? Again, it's an operability problem. So I think that concludes my brief introduction there, Hamid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think you brought a lot of more questions to our heads.
Yes,
yes, you have, and I think yes, this diversification strategy will open a new, lots of new opportunities at the same time, lots of questions to be addressed because of the challenges it was, and that's why we got the Sony program to validate that. I think Dritan told us, and Dimitri did mention that this is going to open a lot of can of worms from another respect for performance point of view and KPI measurements. That was really a challenge. Thank you very much all for giving us your introductory talks. I really appreciate it. I think we now have got a couple of questions from the floor before I come up with my own questions from where we discussed. And I'm sure you got questions from each other at the same time as well. But first of all, the first question from the floor, I think Paul has agreed to answer it. The question is, there are industry moves on the OPSI and CPRI, which for some who don't know what OPSI and CPRI were, OPSI was Nokia's definition of the interface between the radio and the baseband unit, and CPRI was the other big vendors, including Ericsson, Huawei, Alcatel-Lucent, for interface between the radio unit and the baseband unit. So the question is, there was a move for OPSI and CPRI interfaces, and the small suppliers or remote radio heads were available. The business heads in the operations were really conservative on choosing suppliers. What is the difference in 5G compared with 3G and 4G industry spec? Paul, would you like to address that, please?
Oh, I think this is a tremendously interesting question, and I would hesitate to say I have an interest in this, and I was around when the first OPSI versus CPRI interface wars took place, for example. I think it was CPRI 1 and CPRI 2, and of course now we have eCPRI. The data rates are tremendous, 10, 20 gig and more. Now, so that is the major difference, is that eCPRI has become the de facto standard, whether we like it or not. It's just been accepted. And dominant suppliers have come in, decided to go that way, whether or not there are any other aspects of OPSI. So OPSI may be resurrected, but at the moment we're eCPRI. It's been taken on. There's plenty of information on the web. Clearly, from a network infrastructure point of view, my feeling was that open interfaces didn't go far enough. It didn't extend back into the core network. So we have this sort of cloud of our radio interfaces, all interconnected around the core. It needs to go further in. We need to avoid private messaging if at all possible.
Yeah. Paul, sorry, Dritan, you want to address something? Or Paul, have you finished with your reply, or you want to add something?
I think that's it, really, Hamid. It's become the de facto standard and has been taken on. You've got the economies of scale of semiconductors, which of course, we don't have a wafer fab in this country, so we rely on the worldwide suppliers for us.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. Appreciate it. Dritten, would you like to add to that response, please?
Very briefly, I agree with everything that Paul has said. But the and the specific question, I take more of a kind of a business view. So at this moment in time, we know that 3GPP has specified the 8 or the 9 options on the split. And as we all know, and in particular, I'm very conscious of speaking in Swindon with all of the amazing kind of heritage that it has in terms of mobile comms and the people. There will be a lot of, and as Paul said, a lot of names that I will know, not just from Swindon, but elsewhere as well. So we need to look at, nothing comes out of nowhere. So all of those initiatives have taken us to where we are today. At the same time, we are seeing an increase in the capability and the power of the computation, and probably the fact that it is cheaper. So that element of the softwareization, lo and behold, that softwareization is becoming a bit more of a commodity for the telecommunication, pretty much like quite a few of us, including myself, have seen in the late 90s with the IP network. So that's a kind of when certain technology trends come together and break in. So that would be one element. But your question, I think, and it is interesting that it's coming from someone at Altiostar, huge respects. It comes from a perspective that what is different now is there are two elements. There is a politically driven strategy needed, geopolitical need for effectively diversifying the supply chain. And large vendors do not emerge within 3 years or 5 years. They require a lot of time to mature, etc. So that is one side. The other element, which for me is particularly interesting and more interesting, it is the fact that smaller players can effectively go more in a direction of private networks. So that's the private networks is a particular market that if it matures enough, it can be used effectively to mature the products of the small vendors before they are ready to effectively go to a national level, MNO supply level, which is quite a challenging thing to achieve. So I think those will be the two things that I will put in addition to what Paul said on the changes that we are seeing now. And it's really irrelevant that it happens to be the 5G era, but it doesn't have a lot to do with the 5G itself.
I agree. Thank you very much, Dritten. Dimitri, do you want to add to that? Or
I think Paul and Dritten have covered everything, so thanks to both of them.
Thank you very much for that. Right, there is a next question. I think the only thing I want to emphasize on what Dritten also pointed out is about business opportunity when we go in with EC3. It allows, for example, just reflecting on my own experience, the DAS solution in airports and in high-rise buildings, that power discussion that we had, instead of having one big base station broadcasting into a large tower, it could very well be a DAS solution, but creating capacity and having a hoteling or baseband unit and using an EC3 to transmit at 7.2 split or whatever split towards the radio heads, which are then manufactured by different vendors. Doesn't need to be one vendor producing those radio heads, as long as there's standardization. And hopefully by Sonic project, we will see this interoperability across multiple vendors in there, and the hoteling of the baseband unit or the baseband processing happening. That would be just my own reflect on that. Just want to say, Abhaya, do you want to add anything either onto this or not?
No, I think I'll pass that.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we can go to the next question, which is around security from Chris. Does the supply diversification strategy create a security dilemma? Increased sovereignty, sovereign supply, which is good for the UK, but sorry, the small print here in my screen, more differing vendor subsystem interfaces, and hence the attack surfaces, which could be an issue for the user. If so, how do we navigate this issue effectively? I think this is a question to all, I would say, to all, everybody. Does anybody want to raise hand here first? Abhaya, do you want to have a go at answering this first, or
unfortunately, security is not my area. So
okay, all right. So we'll go. Dritten, do you want to have a go at this?
I can take it.
Please,
So first of all, let me just clarify that when we are talking about diversification, we don't mean sovereign supply. We mean more than the 2 vendors that we are having at the moment, increasing to 3, 4, even more. So the diversification, the way that we are looking at the moment, is not to bring necessarily UK vendors into the ecosystem. It's going to be good if we bring some, and if we have some, to bring them on. So when we are looking actually at diversification of supply chain and Open RAN in particular, the one challenge is actually what Drita referred to, the interoperability. The second challenge is security indeed. So to have actually the ecosystem interoperably secure or secure the interoperability of the actual infrastructure, it is very important. And of course, the more vendors we include, the more the complexity of the system increase, and therefore the more the attack surfaces that we are exposing. So it's not an easy problem. When we are looking security in open RAN systems and then in open networking in general, what the UK government has already announced or pre-announced is actually the creation of another initiative parallel to Sonic, which is called UK Telecom Labs or UKTL, which their mission is going to be exclusively to look and certify mainly ready-to-market RAN solutions in terms of their security compliance. So we are having the security bill, which puts a number of requirements. Core security is a technology consideration and a system level consideration. So actually certification is going to be happening in this new instrument, which is going to enact a new facility, which is going to be called, or is called, the UK Telecom Labs, with huge involvement, of course, from industry, from academia, but also from NCSC, advising and so on. So that is going to be a national focus towards security. I'm going to mention again that actually national security is the key driver for diversification. And I think personally that we are going to find other benefits as we go ahead for full open networking, but we are not still there.
Good. Thank you very much, Dimitra. I appreciate it. I think it's a good thing to touch on that. I think that information is also captured in the DCMS webpage. Am I correct, Dimitra? That's been referenced there. Yeah, I can see nods from.
KTL has been pre-announced several times and with different names, but actually the intention is to actually create that organization that would focus very much on security and security certification in real life kind of conditions.
Yeah. Dimitra, will there be yet another catapult from the government towards the telecom world? Is that what?
I don't know. It's a big initiative. It's a big initiative, and definitely is going to, if you like, to consolidate quite a lot of what is going to be happening in the telco sector. As I said before, is going, at least the ambition at the moment is to look at near to market or ready to market solutions.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dimitra. From other panel members, do you have anything to add, please? If you, okay, thank you very much. I hear. So we can go to the next question, which comes from Peter. How will 5G testbeds be able to keep step with software-defined network release schedules of multiple updates per day? I'm sure it's not per day, but okay, I get the message. The question, I think, Dimitra, do you want to address this question by chance?
Well, I can address this question. I'm seeing probably Dritan is ready to address this question as well. So let's do a double act.
Good.
I mean, telecom systems, Dritan mentioned softwareization. A lot of times we are actually going to live with softwareized network systems, network infrastructure that actually we are going to be hosting most of our functions and operations in the cloud. And this is something that is increasingly happening and it's going to happen even more. so our networks increasingly are going to look like IT systems, and we are going to deal with this as we are dealing with upgrades on our IT platforms, where you are having actually, you know, operating system upgrades and, you know, software updates all the time. And it's going to be a very different environment. That's why I mentioned in my introduction that skill evolution in the telco sector is absolutely necessary. We need IT engineers more than we need network engineers increasingly. So upgrades of software is something that we have to live with and develop all the tools to actually guarantee stability of our networks while we are actually upgrading all the time.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Thank you very much. Dritan, do you want to add to that, please?
Yes, thank you. I do agree with Dimitra. Last year in the Science and Technology Parliamentary Committee, the CTO of Rakuten gave one of the evidence, and one of the things that struck me that is publicly available is the fact that he said that he looked at Rakuten future or more as in the way of operation more from an IT perspective than from a telecoms perspective. The system release validation, which is the process through which the software versions are managed in a network, these are kind of existing processes that are managed in monolithic run and monolithic vendor situations. It is true, and it is a good question. And the answer, the Sonic is a testbed, the same way that the Smart Internet Lab, University of Bristol, has a very, very large testbed. It's something that we are facing already. So, for example, at this moment in time, I can tell that we have one RU vendor that, in order to integrate with two different DU vendors, they will need to have two different versions of the software. Now, how will this process manage in an end-by-end situation? It is something that we will need to figure out, and that is precisely one of the elements that we will need to effectively test in the test beds, and something that even more industry will be looking much more closely. And that's why within the mobile industry, you have different preparation and different readiness, publicly at least, and I'm referring only on the public domain, readiness for the adoption of the Open RAN, because managing those software releases throughout a network through different vendors, a situation that we know already is a target from most immediate deployments, immediate in the next couple of years, we talk, is to have one DU vendor interfacing mostly with different RU vendors. And in that situation, how the DU vendor will effectively test and manage multiple RUs, it's something that some vendors have already resolved, like Rakuten, like Mavenir, like Parallel Wireless, like several others maybe, not only these, but it is something that we need to effectively test and probably elevate an understanding of that process, pretty much the way Dimitra put it, across people. And that is where the test beds will help. But the test beds are test beds. They are not like commercial networks. The reliability does not need to be exactly at the same level. That's so right. This process is to use the test beds in order to get to the level of the what we are used to, the 5 nines of the telecoms infrastructure availability.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. That was well put. Thank you. I don't think we have many more questions from the floor. I'm going to go up to my question. I took a few notes, but before I start going through my notes for the questions I had from the panel, more questions I had from the panel, I want to ask, does any of the panel have any question from each other to ask? Dimitri, do you have any questions to ask? Okay. Abhaya, do you have any question to ask from anybody on the floor?
Not particularly. I think,
okay. All right. Teresa, do you have any question? Because before I start being the monologue, I like to sort of ask if you guys have got questions to ask. Teresa, do you have any questions to ask? You're on mute, Teresa.
Not from me as such. We have discussed before, so we roughly know the questions of one another in a way.
Okay. Paul, do you have any question? Has any question come to you since we started the discussion, the debate?
No, not really. I was just reflecting on the security aspect that Dimitri had mentioned, and how on earth do you get that? It was just a concern of recognizing that you have a security issue on it, and once you've recognized it, I suppose that you can work towards a solution, but do you reroute or I don't know what the solution is. It's just I was just reflecting on it in my head, really.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think I'm going to go to the questions. I mean, Dimitra gave a very nice, big, grand opening for us to sort of touch on. And one of the things I wanted to touch on was she mentioned that the challenge ahead is about research and innovation, long-term research and innovation. And I think that's a question to Dimitra, which I'd like her to expand on that a little bit if possible for us, so that we know what is the direction to go for. So in your view, where do you think the future research should be in the world of telecom, as well as softwareization, as well as in interoperability across components, and so effectively it's an open network by the look of it. So please tell us what you see and how you see the innovation coming up and the research of the future, please.
Well, that is a very big open question with a lot of personal flavors, I suppose.
I agree.
And
But pick one area that is really important to you.
I would say that actually the whole trend towards fully open networks, not only RAN, but also current transport, end-to-end open networking, that is going to be a big and challenging research topic because of the complexity that comes with this. Of course, again, I mean, that is associated also with security. It is an important issue of open networks and performance optimization. There's so much that we need to do, from technology to software layers, all the way to end-to-end solutions. So there is a big research questions there, and probably we are going to name it 6G, but go and name it whatever you want. Open networks are where our future is going to be. And Paul mentioned net zero of digital telecom infrastructure and where the challenges are coming from. And for me, yes, it is very good to actually optimize power efficiency of individual components, individual equipment, but actually the net zero problem is an end-to-end problem. And if you are making actually your equipment very energy efficient, but then you are running in the background continuously multiple AI algorithms for optimizing your equipment, then your energy efficiency, your energy consumption budget is going out of the window. So net zero holistically, in order to actually hit those standards by 2030 and then 2050 is very important.
Thank you very much, Dimitra. I think that's a good direction. And with that, I want to go to my question to Dritten, which I'm trying to touch on. There were two aspects, Dritten, that when you talked, it just gave me the spark in my head about two areas. One was engaging with the supply chain in UK, business opportunities in UK. That really meant, to me, it's like the heart of what we really need to do, not just UK, but globally. We need to increase opportunities for small businesses to thrive. So my question was, there is a balance between the standardization and this business creation. Do you want to expand on when you said engage with supply chain in UK? You did touch on that, and I thought that really needed to be a bit more expanded, because it's not just UK, I presume, it's wider than UK, because you want this supply chains to come to UK and have a presence in UK. Is that what you had in mind in a way? Could you please expand on that?
Yes. Thank you, Amit, for the question. So the way we formulate it is that there is this drive for diversification, which is meeting the technology trends that we covered. In that space, meeting the specific needs that the UK government has put forward, which is to have a secure and resilient UK supply chain. By that, the government and everybody in the UK does not mean, as Dimitra said, the UK market is a very small market in the whole world, but it is a need to engage with the ecosystem, both in the UK and internationally, but internationally with a perception and with a view, with an intention and a view that they want to participate in the supply chain in the UK. So the specification and the standards is a global standardization effort. The market is global, and that is also one of the good things that has existed. The overall standardization is the reason why we can travel all over the world using the same mobile phone. So to think that we will effectively look at only a UK geographical solution, it's nonsense. It's not going to happen, and it shouldn't happen, and it is not going to happen. That is not the intention. But the intention is to effectively look for engaging with vendors, potentially increasing the capability and the desire of vendors from all over the world to effectively continue to invest and to do R&D in the UK, in particular to leverage the human capital. We all remember that, in particular in wireless communications, in the 90s and in 2010, and those people have not disappeared. Some of them are on the call today. There is a very, very strong human capital in the wireless domain, in particular in the UK. How that human capital can be leveraged is one of the things that probably the diversification task force, the diversification strategy through the R&D activities that Dimitra mentioned, can take advantage. Now, if we look for specific UK suppliers, at the moment they are very, very sparse. There are very, very specific companies which are highly specialized, and they are part of the supply chain of the existing vendors as OEM equipment suppliers. If some of them are capable to emerge and to enter into a direct subsystem supply, for example, a radio unit developer, where we have several candidates in the UK, which probably need to mature, those are the kind of things that we would like to sort of engage and foster and support. In our case in Sonic, through providing an environment as a test house, supported, and a large infrastructure for end-to-end testing. But other places like the National Telecoms capability that Dimitra mentioned in terms of certification, and maybe in other test beds, federated test beds, where the R&D capability can be taken forward. If all of these are connected together in a good way, then we probably can see a re-emergence of the industrial R&D capabilities in wireless and in networks in the UK, which probably we have seen a bit of a contraction in terms of investments in the past 10 to 15 years.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. I think that was a good expansion. Thank you very much for that details. I've got another question for up higher, which is about the shared spectrum. I think it's a good innovation from Ofcom, where they provide opportunity for us to use shared spectrum. There are 4 bands in there, as I understand. This is an opportunity for independent networks enterprises to happen. Which, do you want to expand on this for us, please? The opportunities versus okay, the operators will be denied a little bit of a space, but the operators are not able to cover certain areas. Therefore, this is complementing. It's a win-win scenario. Do you want to expand on that, the logic behind that shared spectrum, please? And with another touch is that band 77, higher band 77, particularly is valuable in the band between 3.8 and 4.2 gigahertz. And when do we see this band more available from device support as well as base station support, the RU supports? Right now, these are scarce commodities. And I think I'll come back to Paul. Paul has got something to add to that as well. Abhay, do you want to go on, please?
Yeah, so let me, first of all, I think just remind everybody what we have from Ofcom. It's a very good initiative. I think a good start, I would say. So there are 2 different frameworks that Ofcom introduced. One is local access spectrum, other one is shared access spectrum. So shared access spectrum is about, there's 4 different bands. I think it's 1800. There's a small part of 1800, about 3 megahertz, which we used to call, I think, decked guard band. So it's concurrent shared access. It used to be. Now that particular 3 megahertz band. Now don't forget, that is not the 1800 megahertz band that EE is using mostly for their mobile services. and a little bit about 10 megahertz, if I remember correctly, 2.3 gigahertz band, and 3.8 to 4.2, plus 26 gigahertz band as well, indoor use only. So these 4 bands now can be make available as a license for anybody to use. If anyone wants to use that, they can, I think, approach Ofcom and get a license to use. So in terms of in terms of getting again that ecosystem development point of view, this is a good opportunity to test if there's a demand and what kind of demand is available. So yeah, we talk about 3.8 to 4.2, but currently there's auction ongoing as well, just band below that. And 3.4 to 3.6 is the band that most widely deployed 5G networks. Reason I mention these things is because this is adjacent to that globally harmonized band. So that is really important. 3.5 gigahertz band is one of the globally harmonized band used now, identified for 5G. What does it mean? It means, again, as I mentioned, global ecosystem development. So that can now spread beyond the band, and because it's right next to this globally harmonized band, it is much better than somewhere far away in terms of ecosystem development. So this band is very, very useful. We call somewhere right in the middle, not the coverage band, coverage layer where 700 megahertz and sub 1 gigahertz band, or the millimeter wave bands, which is we know the characteristics, very short distances and wide bandwidths. But this mid band, 3.5 gigahertz band, sits rightly at the middle. And this band we are talking about, 3.8 to 4.2, is right next to that, the globally harmonized band, and 3GPP now standardized as well. So I think in terms of equipment availability, all I can say is at this stage, because it's right next to that globally harmonized band, it is going to be it's better in terms of
so we have a higher chance of its adoption.
Exactly. I think so currently, I think as we know, the most of the standard equipment from the equipment vendors supports up to about 400 megahertz, the power amplifiers, which probably lies a little bit beyond the reach of 3.8 to 4.2, but that tuning, I think over the time, when the equipment matures, that could improve. I think that's what. But if I also touch a little bit on the local access spectrum, which is, I think you mentioned about mobile operators spectrum that can be basically shared if a user wanted. Now that is again a new trend in loads of regulators really try to look at this local specific use for local access, and these new emerging frameworks will drive innovation, will drive these equipment vendors to because more use of the spectrum, and that will help again in terms of this objective of I guess diversification strategy.
Great. Thank you very much, Alpay. I think with that, I'm going to go to Paul and ask him about dynamic spectrum allocation. Paul, do you have any view that this dynamic spectrum sharing could become popular in your experience?
My experience, well, put that
in your future experience.
What I was going to comment on was this new band 77 is such a wide, as Abe was saying, 3300 to 4200. I've got the 3GP spec there, so I can read out the numbers. Of course, it is a TDD band, and I think historically it's deployed mostly for indoor systems and perhaps it doesn't give you quite as much capacity as some of the other bands. As FDD operation, obviously, I don't want to get in that debate at the moment, but we need to be mindful that bandwidth is a commodity, and we may need to pay for it in a way that we have infrastructure for roads, and I think Abe has had a model discussed where you'd pay almost on a per hertz basis for how much frequency you use. So if there isn't much use during the night, then you use as much bandwidth as you can for your IoT devices. And then during the day for voice, you have an allocation, dynamically move the voice, say, to the lower frequency bands. So I do feel that there is an opportunity there to have dynamic spectrum access linked with almost a pay as you use basis, whether it's paying for every context you make or pay it on a daily basis. I wouldn't know. That would depend on the features you're using. But say, for example, if you were using a car where you need a very, very high mission critical type of service, then perhaps there's an opportunity there for almost a road funding license, whereby you would buy the operation of that car, the necessary operation for that, as part of a taxation possibility. Actually, that's a whole new idea, isn't it, for HMG? Taxation for bandwidth.
That's a good idea. I think that's the idea. But innovation is about discussion.
Yeah.
I think we've covered all the questions that I had, as well as questions from the floor. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our panel for attending and giving us the talk and the wisdom of their knowledge, and really appreciate all of you for joining us and giving us your thought process in this debate on UK 5G supply chain diversification strategy. Maybe in the next sessions we will talk about open source solutions that are really buzzing around and could fuel this next movement in innovation and so on. So with that, I'd like to thank the panel and pass to Walter. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Yes, thank you indeed. Yeah, thank you for your attendance. Thank you for the questions. Very much appreciate all the input from the panel and Hamid for moderating. Tough job, difficult subject, but a lot of interesting points raised that certainly given me food for thought. I certainly look forward to the publication of the task force report now, and also hearing further updates on Sonic as that's launched in June, as I understand it.